You're listening to part 2 of a Dear Applicants podcast episode. Check out last week's episode to listen to part 1 of this interview. So it sounds like there were a lot of conversations going on. It seems almost like dinner table conversations, right? That these kids are going away, reading, learning, and then coming back and saying, look, maybe my perspective's changed a little bit, or maybe I want to do this instead. Where was the information coming from when these discussions were being had? Like, yes, once you signed on with IvyPrep and they started working with Joey and then Chihan and Alan respectively, that's where the information was coming from. But before that?
I think the young read a lot now.
Did they?
Well, read a lot online.
Okay.
Right? Whether it's true, so it's, we've had discussions and they say, yes, we know. So obviously, you have to look at where the source of the information comes from. I'm not a fan of Wikipedia. I tend to go to different sources. So they do, I think, read whether it's through news media, I think when you talk about Instagram or different ways, it may not be the traditional way of reading books than what we grew up with, and I think also for them talking with their friends, and I think with what's available, online, they're able to read about experiences of other people, and they can go to the websites themselves or the universities to check and look at courses. So, and I think as parents, we've pretty much let them, find their own way. Because I think, and that's I think what I found useful about the IvyPrep process was that when, especially with Brian, when he was writing his personal statement, there was some guidance, but a lot of it came from himself. Because I always believe it's very important for their own voice to be heard. Because college admissions people, they've seen so many admissions, they can tell when something's been, crafted, with a lot of help from a professional versus something that's written mainly by the student.
Yeah, I agree. And even when I used to interview for Yale and US when I was in my final year, it was very easy to tell when somebody had been coached.
Yes, right.
And when it was, and even, I guess it's not so easy to tell when someone's been coached if the answers are still authentic. So if they've learned the skills, but the content is theirs, then it's fine.
Yep.
But when you can tell when an answer is maybe rehearsed is a better word to use than coached.
Yes.
You can tell when they're sort of just word vomiting a sort of answer as opposed to answering truthfully. So I think that is something to think about. It's also worth pointing out that with most consultancies, I guess the best outcomes come when the consultancies and the advisors are able to provide structure, information, and framework, but the meat of the content is still coming from the students themselves.
Yes,
right? Because there's no replacement for that.
Correct. So I think that, as parents, we'll try to guide our children the best way we can while giving them, I think, that autonomy and independence to, make their own minds within reasonable limits. But I think oftentimes, viewpoints of parents may not be, taken on wholesale. And I think that's when an external party comes in, right? Because then, when we say, okay, we're working with this company called IvyPrep, right? They actually help students like yourselves to get into, colleges, and this is what they have done. They've worked with that many people. So then they say, okay, this is a company that knows what they're doing because they're in the scene. Unlike us, we're parents, we may have, years of wisdom, but we're not educational specialists, right? So what would we know? And the last time we were in university was decades ago. So our knowledge would be, in their views, seem to be, backdated and not current.
Keeping with that, were there any, I guess, beliefs or things that you thought were true of the admissions process that were debunked or that were challenged when you started working with us? Or was it more learning what the the admissions process actually entailed?
I think I had heard, from friends who had kids in doing college admissions that, it's a very, thorough, rigorous process, and especially in the US where you have to, write an essay for each. So in fact, my husband was saying, sounds like a lot of work, so I think that's when, as for parents, I think, having, an IvyPrep with us makes things a lot easier, because then, like you say, you provide the structure, and sometimes kids need to be nudged along. Right, so rather than us doing the nagging, I think if the nagging comes from an external party and just to move the process along, I think that also helps.
Yeah, and we were, just before the camera started rolling, we were speaking, what you told me is something that I hear from a lot of parents, right? That very often it's better when the same information comes from a third party rather than from the parents, because often kids don't want to hear it from their parents.
Yes, then I sometimes have to refrain myself. But I do often tell them, I said, see, that's what I said in the first place. But, never
Can't
mind.
help
At least
yourself to
we've come to
defend
the
that.
same conclusion. But, then you know that your mom is right most of the time.
But I'd like to start, sort of move to talking about your experiences with IvyPrep a little bit more directly.
Sure.
Starting with the onboarding process. I know you had initially met a colleague of mine, Pragya, who we had also incidentally interviewed a couple months ago, and I can send you the link if you'd like. You met with her, and then of course you met with Joey Allen.
That's right,
Shihan.
yes.
What was that experience like, those initial meetings, before you decided to work with us?
Well, I think I hadn't, any expectations when I started because, as I mentioned, my own university application process was very straightforward, right? So I came only with the expectation of, that this is a company who obviously has a strong history and track record in helping students, I think not just with placements, but I think in helping them with the whole process of, because I'm sure you have kids who come to you who are not sure of what they want to do, right? And how, I wasn't sure whether, they seem quite clear, but I was thinking even if there were, working with IvyPrep could probably help them crystallize, their thoughts even further. And hopefully they'll be able to come to a decision that, yes, this is the course I want to take. So we did come, to IvyPrep with an open mind. We weren't sure of what the process was about. And I think
Well, the processes were quite different, right, as well?
Yes, correct. So, Dylan had worked on the Head Start process, and with Brian, it was,
It was a little bit more direct.
Yes, it was more direct, and I think particularly with the UK system,
Yeah.
unlike the US. But I thought the presentation was very clear, and I came away, very impressed, thinking that wow, it's a very robust and structured process, which I think you need to, because there are a lot of many variables when you talk about university placements. Right, I know of people who've had 45 IB scores, student leader. And yet we're not able to get into an Ivy League school, right? You think that you would have ticked all the boxes, but that doesn't mean that it's a given. Unlike 10, 15 years ago, when you'd had this score, you would probably get a place in one of the Ivy League schools. So she did, get a place, but not the first few choices that she wanted, which was surprising to me. So, right, I thought that, with IvyPrep, I think having, a very systematic process, and a structure would definitely help.
I think, just speaking to your last point, it's, as you can imagine, we meet a lot of parents that have done quite well for themselves, but also had done very well academically back when they were in school, a lot of whom, I guess, were amongst the second or third generation of Singaporeans to actually be going overseas to the Ivy Leagues, or, Oxford, Cambridge. And back then it was a little bit more straightforward. Like you said, not easy, of course, still very difficult and an achievement in and of itself, but a little bit more straightforward than it is today. And a lot of them seem to think it'll be the same way, right? And the way you apply is very similar, but it's not the case. And then, of course, there's so many more Singaporeans applying, which makes competition all the more difficult. And so there are a lot of boxes to tick, but also narratives that you need to frame, not just in a correct way, but in an authentic way.
Yes.
You need to be able to sell yourself, both in the US and the UK, as someone who is genuine, authentic, and just a curious person, right? In the UK, maybe a little bit more intellectually curious in that specific area. In the US, it'll be a little broader, right? And a little bit more community focused, perhaps. Right. And it's true to say that we get a lot of students who are scholars now, who have applied once, they've applied with the grades, they've applied with the accolades, and they don't get in. And they work with us, get their stories framed right, and then they do. So I think with a lot of students, especially the really bright ones, it's a very close run thing, and sometimes they just need a little bit of fine tuning, a little bit of direction when it comes to how do you tell your story that then helps them get in at the end. But anyway, I sort of derailed the conversation.
Yeah, but I guess one other thing I thought about, yes, obviously, you've got those who are, very academically driven, with the right, co-curricular activities coming to you. How about kids who come in who are kind of average? Right, obviously, we know that if they come in with average grades, the Ivy League wouldn't be realistic. So, do you work with kids like that, to non-Ivy League universities? How do you help, children students who are, average or even below average, for example?
We do. So we work with a range of students, and that comes not just in terms of background, but also in terms of how they're doing academically, and in terms of their performance with grades. With the students who maybe not be seeing A's, but more a mix of A's and B's or B's and C's, it's more trying to understand what they want to do. So a very similar process in terms of trying to figure out what it is they'd like to study, and identifying universities that are going to be the best fit for them. Now, those might not be the tippy top sort of Stanford, Harvard types, and this is something that we do stress and say, look, it's not the end of the world that you're not going to Harvard or Yale, and definitely this is something that could be on the cards for you as a master's or another postgraduate degree later on. But at present, it's a little bit more taking stock of your grades, taking stock of your SATs if you want to go to the US, taking a look at your activities as well, and then picking best fit universities that you are going to enjoy. Not just any university out there. And some parents, some students tend to be, especially from Singapore, tend to place a lot of emphasis on rankings. And so then, of course, that plays a factor. And a lot of people say, why go overseas when I could just go to NUS because NUS is ranked number 11 or 12. Of course, there are a lot of factors that go into that may not be telling the full story. But for those, I'm going on a sort of bit of a circuitous route, but for those students, it's more about finding universities that they will like, that are strong in their subject, and that will give them a good base for whatever professional future they want to have. And it's funny when you speak to people outside of Singapore, a lot of universities that Singaporeans would scoff at, expats and foreigners would hold in very high regard.
Yes.
I think it's unfortunate that rankings play such a massive factor in the universities that students choose to go to, because it's really not the be all and end all. There's so many factors that contribute to a ranking, including the size of the faculty and endowment and research budgets, most of which is not going to touch an undergraduate student.
Right, and specifically, I think the course that you want to study, because there may be some, for example, like in sports science, there'll be certain universities that were very strong in sports science, but will not, be on the ranking, for example.
Like Bournemouth, for example, right? Which is it strong?
And I know there's a Loughborough that's
well-known, for sports management, but
correct.
Most would not want to.
Yes,
yeah. Before we continue, I would like to take a quick break to remind you to subscribe to our podcast and leave us a review on your favorite platform. Your feedback helps us improve and to reach a wider audience to provide further insight into this arduous journey. Also, if you have any questions or suggestions for future episodes, feel free to email us at our email linked in the description below. We'd love to hear from you. Yeah, but that was an interesting question. This is the first time I've been asked a question.
No, because I guess when you think of the name IvyPrep, right, people think, okay, Ivy is Ivy League. So, I guess people would say, okay, if a child is already, we anticipate the child would do 40 and above, obviously the chances of them getting into university are higher. But those who need more help are those who are middle, or maybe, some kids don't do well in exams, for example, right? And they didn't do well at all, so, couldn't get into local universities, so they would want to, look at overseas universities. So, that's what I was wondering, in talking to friends, would IvyPrep be able to help them in these parents? Because then I think when we talked to Chihan, he was telling us that you have what you call, your stretch universities. Yeah. So I think
match and safety.
Yeah, so I think we have to be realistic as parents, because we each know our children, right? And I guess if you know your child is not able to cope in a academically competitive environment, then that may not be, they may not be best cited to be in that university, right?
That's a tough conversation to have, but one we have nevertheless with a lot of parents. So yes, to answer your question again, we do work with all sorts of students from all sorts of academic backgrounds, and you don't need to be a straight A student to meet with us. The name IvyPrep, I guess, comes from the origins of the company. It was founded by 4 Ivy League graduates.
Okay.
And so they called it IvyPrep. Another question or comment that we get is, if you're called IvyPrep, do you really help with students who are going to the UK? And the answer is yes.
Yes, okay. So it's mainly the UK, US.
UK and US only.
Okay, only, right? That's right, yes.
So we specialize in the US and the UK since we started about 12 years ago.
Right.
And the only thing that we've added to it is we've gone, the correct word for it is, I guess we've just brought in the scope to younger students as well, not other countries.
Sure, okay.
Yeah. Any other questions?
No, I think that's it.
Okay. So why did you end up choosing IvyPrep in the end? I know you've been saying a lot of nice things, but if you were to be able to summarize that in a sentence or two.
I think, I think my husband and I were normally quite decisive. So, you know, we're not
I
the type
remember,
to you know, do too much comparison shopping. I think, you know, when we, especially I think word of mouth makes a difference, right? And you've heard from people that, IvyPrep was very effective. And then we thought, okay, right?
That's how we get most of our students as well, through word of mouth.
Yeah.
And so you met us, and then you were saying you're decisive, so you just made up your mind and went with it.
Oh yes, but the first meeting we had decided, you know, we'd proceed, and then you know, there were different consultants obviously working with each of the boys.
And were there any major reflections that you guys had? I guess Dylan's journey has not yet ended, so maybe not with him, but in regards to Brian, were there any major reflections that you had in regards to his process?
His, I think, took a bit longer, mainly, well, he had a bit more time because he's in national service, so he had a year. And I think because he was in national service, I think some of the meetings, you know, he couldn't meet as frequently, and, you know, I think it took a bit longer, I think, to basically work through the personal statement because, like I said, depending on, you know, when his training was. But on the whole, I have to say I didn't really get involved much once the consultants had worked with the boys. I just pretty much, you know, left them to it, and I'll just check in once in a while, how's it going? And then when he said, oh, it was ready to go, and then he put in the application on his own, and then we just waited for the offers to come in.
And how did Brian feel about working with us? So would you be able to speak to that, or?
I'm not sure if I could, but from...
Well, hopefully we'll hear it from him himself.
Yeah, but from what I could gather, I think, you know, he enjoyed, you know, working with Joey. I think she had helped. I think she had quite good pointers. I think, you know, to try to get him to, I think, focus on what his strengths were. I think what he was hoping to get out of studying physiotherapy, how he felt he could contribute. So I think, you know, higher level, I guess, questions that, you know, helped him, I think, build a stronger personal statement.
Thank you very much for that answer. Is there any advice, I guess as a parting statement, is there any advice or any words of wisdom that you have for parents who are in your shoes, right? With kids, one or two maybe, who are looking to study overseas, either in the US and the UK, are wondering about, you know, whether they should engage a consultant, who should they engage, anything that you would have to say to them?
I guess for me, just based on my own personal experience, I think, you know, having an external party, I think, gives, I think, an added perspective. I think, you know, when you think about the university applications, because, you know, even if parents, you know, had gone to study overseas, that would have been decades ago. So I think that the application process is very different from what we went through. I mean,
constantly evolving.
Yes, it's constantly evolving as well. And I guess, you know, we tried to be open, right? I mean, I think a lot of parents, you know, especially if I think our children are academically stronger and we think that, oh, maybe they could do law, you know, medicine. But I think that's not for every child. I mean, we had asked Brian, he said, okay, why don't you, you know, think about medicine? And he said, no, it's not for me. And I think it's giving them that space to decide on their own. You know, because it's ultimately they're the ones who have to go through the course themselves, right? And you know, live with whatever, you know, course they choose with. Yes, exactly.
Okay. Well, thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been lovely having you and really nice chatting. And thank you, students and parents, for joining us. We will see you next time.
Thank you.
That's all for today's episode of Dear Applicants. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope that you found the content valuable and insightful. If you'd like to learn more about our guests or the topics we discussed, be sure to check out our show notes for links and further resources.